What a treat. We're joined by a man who's come off the road. He's been on the road throughout the Stanley Cup playoffs. Now he's back home looking very sharp in a blue blazer at home. It is our hockey insider, Pierre LeBrun. And Pierre, it's great to see you. And first of all, thanks for being on the show. I like to say that to you. Thanks for being on the show.
I've missed you, man. And you know that when you throw compliments at me off the top, it's going to work. I mean, it's going to be good for you if you go that route. So thank you for knowing how fragile I am and for introducing me with lots of love.
Listen, Pierre, we're in TV. We're all fragile. So, I get it. Trust me. I get it more than anybody does. Hey, Sheldon Keefe, this is wild. I thought maybe he'd go away for a couple of years. He'd chill for a little bit. He'd collect that Leafs paycheck. But he's, according to you and Darren Dreger, he is going to be the next head coach of the New Jersey Devils. And, before people say, well, what about that 2-year contract? Well, I believe that's going to be ripped up, and he'll get a nice new 4-year contract with the Devils. So it's going to work out for Keefe, but it is kind of funny because you're going from one team with high-end talent and iffy goaltending to another team with high-end talent and iffy goaltending. Why did he decide to take the Devils job?
Well, certainly the Devils aim to fix that. I think they'll try to reignite talks on Jacob Markstrom, but we'll talk about that another time, trade talks with Calgary. Because they do need to upgrade their goaltending. This was a really fascinating thing. You may remember the day that Sheldon Keefe got fired by the Leafs, we reported that the Devils immediately picked up the phone and asked the Leafs permission to speak with Sheldon Keefe, which they were granted by the Leafs. But it wasn't that easy. I mean, the Devils really have to stay at this because I think for Sheldon Keefe, this was, he really took this hard, this firing. And I think he really needed to decompress a bit before wrapping his mind around whether or not he could jump back in and give this what it needs to be given to be a head coach again. And my understanding is the Devils GM Tom Fitzgerald has stayed at it. Remember, the Devils interviewed a number of candidates. They had a couple with Craig Berube, a couple with Todd McClellan. They went deep with Jay Whipcroft. They had a few other candidates that they interviewed. But they kept waiting to see if Sheldon Keefe would be open to this idea, and ultimately he was. And you're right, yeah, I mean, Sheldon Keefe could have stayed out at least a year. He had a 2-year extension come up with the Leafs, but the Devils ripped that up and give him a fresh 4-year deal, and you can read into that a raise on what he would have got on that 2-year extension with the Leafs. And I think, I've talked to other coaches around the league. The Devils are one of those spots, Jay, that they're just primed for a bounce back. This is a team that was over 100 points 2 years ago. The big injury to Dougie Hamilton, the pressure of expectations, Jack Hughes in and out of the lineup. This is a bounce back team, certainly if they can fix their goaltending. And I think Sheldon Keefe should be a great fit there.
Now, obviously the Kings like what they saw from Jim Hiller as the interim head coach of the team for the latter half of the season. Even though they had the first-round exit, he has had that interim tag taken off. He is now their head coach. But this is interesting, Pierre. During the exit interviews in early May, Kevin Fiala, who's now starring for the Swiss team at the World Hockey Championships, expressed his frustration about the Kings playing that 1-3-1 neutral zone trap. Take a listen.
Obviously, it would be fun to try something else.
I love that line. Obviously, it would be fun to try something else. In case we weren't sure, he's confirming it would be fun. So, Pierre, will it be more fun to play in LA next season?
Yeah, that's definitely the plan. And my understanding of what happened there is Jim Hiller, takes over in February for Todd McClellan, and they just didn't think as an organization, now's the time to blow up the system and completely redo everything with the Kings' life and death to make the playoffs, if you remember, Jay. So they really tried to just, tweak a few things, but really just try to play survival hockey and get in the playoffs, and they did. But the reality is, part of the many discussions that GM Rob Blake had with Jim Hiller over the last couple of weeks in the lead up to saying, you know what, this is our guy. Near the end of those conversations, my understanding is that, yeah, we're going away from the 1-3-1. And what does that look like in your mind, Jim? And they went from there. So the Kings will play a different system next year. We'll see what that looks like next fall. But, good for a guy like Jim Hiller, too, who's been around a long time, right? And it just shows you that you work away, and one day you'll get your chance. It's hard, only 32 jobs. Now, the other thing we should point out, the Kings did not make this part official, but expect an announcement at some point in the coming days, DJ Smith, the former Senators head coach who had joined that staff for the rest of the year, is also staying on. They've re-signed him, and so he'll stay part of Jim Hiller's coaching staff.
Let's talk about the Winnipeg Jets. We thought maybe all signs were pointing to Scott Arniel after the terrific job he did filling in for Rick Bowness over the course of the season. But where are the Jets in their search, Pierre? Because as of now, it doesn't seem like anything's happened.
Yeah, so listen, I think they felt it important to certainly speak to other candidates. We know they spoke with Craig Berube. They spoke with Todd McClellan. So it's certainly not like they sat there and said, we're just going to hand this to Scott Arniel without even having a process. They've definitely had a process. That process is still not over, and it's still not 100%, but my sense of it is that it's most likely going to Scott Arniel after having gone through this process. Again, I'm not ready to say that's 100%, but I think that's where that's the leading indication. And you see this sometimes where you go through the process, hear from other coaches, which is a useful tool sometimes. If you're the Jets and other teams have done this, where you get to hear from other coaches about what they think of your team.
Yep.
And so it can be a fruitful exercise, but all signs point to Scott Arniel.
Let's talk about the San Jose Sharks. They are in need of a head coach. And is it possible, Pierre, that if you're a Sharks fan, and boy, if you're a Sharks fan, you've dealt with some pretty rough times the last few years, is it possible that a familiar face from the past might at least get a chance to interview for that head coaching job?
Yeah, what we've confirmed is that the Sharks have sought and received permission from the LA Kings to speak with Marco Sturm. A former Shark star, a very popular player in that market. So I kind of love this as a fit. Marco Sturm, who has been a head coach with the Kings AHL team and cut his teeth there. And obviously with Jim Hiller's hire, kind of roadblocked, in terms of, getting that head coach job in LA. So I'm not saying he's necessarily going to get the job in San Jose. The Sharks, I'm told, are still going through their process and looking at different options, but they do intend to have Sturm as part of that process. So we'll see where it leads to.
I love that idea too. I think it's a terrific idea. I hope it works out. The Leafs, as you know, introduced Craig Berube as their new head coach on Tuesday. We found out over the weekend. Yeah, I know. We did very little coverage on it, but we touched on it. And then Rod Brind'Amour, of course, staying in Carolina on a 5-year deal. And I know our mutual friend Jeff O'Neill, as much respect as he has for Berube, was very intrigued with the idea of Brind'Amour coming to Toronto. And Jeff might be a little biased because he played with the guy, but I think a lot of Leafs Nation was intrigued by the idea. Was there any sense, Pierre, in your mind that was even potentially close for the Leafs and Brind'Amour?
Well, yeah, Jay, here's what I will say. It's not a coincidence, the timing of all these announcements and events. I mean, the Leafs finalized and announced Berube on the Friday. The Hurricanes finalized their deal with Brind'Amour. I'm trying to remember now. I think on Saturday night.
That's right.
It doesn't get made official until Sunday.
Yep.
And then Berube news conference on Tuesday. So all these things kind of overlapping. What I would tell you with confidence is that at the very least, I think if Rod Brind'Amour had left Carolina, the Leafs would have sought permission to at least talk to him. I'm not saying he would necessarily have been the guy, but they certainly would have wanted to find out what was going on there. Mm-hmm. And I think they did have tabs on that whole situation before they ultimately finalized things with the guy they loved from the beginning in Craig Berube. So, yeah, it's not a coincidence that all these things were lined up that way. But Rod Brind'Amour not only signs a 5-year deal, which is rare these days in the NHL coaching carousel. And
took care of his assistants, too, which I know is really important to him. I love reading your columns in The Athletic. You shot down the rumors of a potential Mitch Marner to Nashville union in The Athletic on Wednesday. So I guess my next question is, what is the situation with Marner right now? And do you think there'll be any kind of resolution anytime soon?
Yeah, Jay, I shot down in the sense that I actually understand why the idea is out there and why it makes sense. I mean, the Predators have made it a priority to upgrade offensively this summer. They also have a goalie they hope to extend in UC Saros, a star goalie, and if they can't extend him, maybe they trade him. So I understand how a lot of smart people put some stars aligning together here and think that Nashville and Toronto could be a match. But what I was trying to report is that I'm not saying it can't ever come to that point where these two teams have that conversation. I'm just telling you it hasn't happened at this point.
Right.
The two teams have not talked about Mitch Marner, and part of that is the Leafs were busy trying to figure out their coaching situation, so they haven't moved on yet to that part of the offseason. But part of what I wrote about too in that column is that this thing has a lot of layers. I mean, at the end of the day, for example, I have no evidence from making a few phone calls this week that Mitch Marner's camp is preparing a list and going to hand over a list to Brad Treliving, the Leafs GM, saying these are places we might go. That's not what vibes I'm getting there from the Marner camp. It sounds very much like, hey, we have a year left on our deal. We're going to honor it, and we love playing for the Leafs. And it's important to note that at this juncture because Mitch Marner is a full no move. So I guess it's my way of saying this still could go a lot of different ways, including potentially a Marner trade this summer. But it's going to have to come from the Leafs getting the kind of offer from somewhere else where they feel they have to bring it to Marner's camp, and not the other way around, if that makes any sense. Matthew Tkachuk, 2 years ago, his camp handed a list of 5-6 teams to Calgary. That's not the sense I'm getting that at this particular juncture, Marner's camp intends to go that route. But again, if anything, if there's one takeaway from my column, is that it's early and not a whole lot has happened on the Marner front. So let's all take a deep breath.
Well, and Pierre, I'm sure that's the last we'll hear about it all summer. I'm sure we won't hear a thing.
Oh, my goodness.
Okay.
If I was better at an eye roll, I would have done one right there. But
we'll see if we can add an eye roll emoji to this interview for the show. You spent the last round following the Dallas Stars. I love that you got to see him up close in person. The series against Edmonton starts on Thursday, Western Conference Final. Based on what you saw, Pierre, do you think the Stars can contain the McDavids and Draisaitl's the way they were able to contain the McKinnons?
Yeah. Well, you touched on something very important there, is that they just had a similar matchup. Chris Tanev was deployed exclusively whenever Pete DeBoer could get it out there. Chris Tanev versus Nate McKinnon, and it was a fascinating matchup that went back and forth. McKinnon had his moments, but Tanev had an unbelievable series after having an unbelievable series matched up against Jack Eichel in the first round. So you know what Chris Tanev's job is going to be in the Western Conference Final. I just don't know if he can be out there as often as number 97 is out there for the Oilers, but that'll be the key matchup of the series. The Stars are the deepest team in the league. I mean, their depth is unmatched, unrivaled. But again, Connor McDavid and Leon Draisaitl and Evan Bouchard have shown in these playoffs that while their team is top heavy, when you're that good, you can carry your team through adversity. So I think this is going to be a 7-game series. And again, the key to me, as obvious as it sounds, but when you're in the rink watching it like I did last round, Tanev versus McKinnon, Tanev versus McDavid will be the series in my mind.